Hi, welcome to the show. Today, we have the president and CEO of Juliet's House, Russell Mark. And I know if you've heard of Juliet's House, you're a supporter. And if you haven't, stay tuned. We're going to learn a lot today. They have a new program that they're rolling out into the community. It's going to make a big difference. So, Russell, thanks so much for being here with us
Thank you,
today.
Ken. I appreciate being here.
Well, it's a real privilege to have you here. You're quite a presence at the fundraiser. I just so enjoyed your remarks. When you come to the greeters at Chamber, everybody's glad to see you. You speak so well about Juliet's House. It's just really, I think, made a big difference in the community. I'm so grateful you're here. How long have you been in town?
A little over 3 years now.
Has it been that short?
It
I mean,
has
that
been
long.
that
It
short.
just seems like you
or
just
long.
got here. Yeah. Well, you've really raised the awareness, I think, in the community of what Juliet's House does. Tell us a little bit about the mission.
We are a child abuse intervention center, which means that we're both involved in prevention of child abuse and intervening where child abuse has taken place. We work very, very closely with law enforcement, with Child Protective Services, the DA's office, as well as any number of local agencies that are working with kids and families. Our whole approach, our vision is we want healthy families in this community, and we want to prevent child abuse from ever occurring. We span the gamut from providing support and what we call the assessment of a child that has been abused or severely neglected. We now offer treatment. We've just recently hired our own in-house therapist that is specially trained to work with the trauma of children who have been abused. We're very excited about that and expect that program to expand significantly over the next few years.
Now, you have two almost separate pieces at Juliet's House. One is intervention, which you've talked about just then, and then prevention. I think the prevention is the thing that people can really get involved with, but let's just touch on the intervention now for a few minutes. You said that agencies will refer cases to you.
Correct.
Where there has been evidence of abuse, and you explore that and treat that. Can you tell us a little bit how that goes?
The process is a referral comes to us from the Department of Human Services or law enforcement, occasionally from a medical provider, that there are signs that this child has been abused. Somebody's made a disclosure, perhaps. A family member called and said, little Juanita is being hurt by her uncle, let's say. So DHS gets involved immediately. The first step is to make sure that that child is safe. So whoever the alleged abuser is removed from that situation. In rare cases, the child is actually pulled out because it may be both of their primary caregivers, their parents, for instance. That's not that often as most people think, but in rare situations, it does have to happen to protect that child or any other children that might be in the family.
Well, oftentimes the child and family members will come to Juliet's House. Is that
Absolutely. They come, we do a medical exam of the child. We don't always see that child immediately. We even see children that the abuse may have taken 2 or 3 years before.
I see.
But they're just now at a point in their life that they're able to talk about what happened. Or they may be old enough to have the verbal skills to talk about what happened. So they come to us, we do an exam, depending on the type of exam depends on where they are in this process. It can be just a simple wellness check, or it can be something more extensive, depending on the circumstances with this particular child. And then they meet with a forensic interviewer, someone who's highly trained to help that child in their own way, in their own time, tell their story. We capture that part of the assessment on videotape and recorded, because that may be used in a grand jury. If there's enough finding that the alleged abuser has indeed done it, according to this child, there's enough evidence there, then the DA's office may say, yeah, we need this. And under subpoena and protective order, we will provide that video to them for the purposes of prosecution.
And then your job related to the abuser is pretty much done.
Yes.
Now you have the child still here.
Yes.
And you talked about you're excited to get a new psychologist.
Exactly.
Tell me more about that.
When the child is with us and they're primary caregivers at that point, there may be a host of other services that this family needs. They may come in and it may be a mom that one child is being seen for assessment, but she's got 2 or 3 other kids, maybe under the age of 5, and is just totally overwhelmed. We want to get them connected with services in the community that's going to help her. Because if that environment in which that child is living is going to be stronger and healthier, it's our obligation to provide them those services, or at least to connect them with those services. Our focus is always primarily on that child, which is why I see what we do at Juliet's House is more, on the intervention side, is more diagnostic than it is investigative.
Yeah.
And many people sometimes confuse us because we do work collaboratively with law enforcement and DHS and the DA's office, that we're part of the investigation. Not really. We're focused on what's happened to this child and how do we help move them forward in their life to be happier, more productive, healthier.
So the trauma-informed psychologist.
Right.
That'll be, maybe the child would come back for visits.
Right.
Over a
We're
period of
so
time.
excited because this has been one of the components that we've been lacking at Juliet's House. In our 21 years of service, we've not had a full-time in-house therapist, so that once they've completed the intervention process, we can provide this sort of warm handoff to a therapist who already has access to their records, knows the story. The child doesn't have to be re-traumatized by telling their story all over again to some other therapist in some other organization that
Another
doesn't know
building.
anything
Yeah.
about them. So, and they're already in an environment that is designed specifically to be warm and friendly and as happy as possible. It's a joy to me because I see kids and families come through the front door. They're upset, they're confused, some of them are very angry, the parents particularly. Kids may be withdrawn. And after their time with us, and some kids spend between 3 and 6 hours with us because we let them talk at their own, tell their story in their own way.
Yeah.
When they leave, they're hugging, they're oftentimes laughing, they feel safe, they feel secure, they feel believed.
I've taken the tour through Juliet's house, and couple of the rooms are floor to ceiling stuffed animals.
Right, right. Every child gets a stuffed animal and a blanket.
Yeah, it's very,
all of which are supplied by the community.
very child friendly.
Yeah.
The furniture, the whole arrangement.
We're so fortunate. Back in the early 90s, a grassroots movement grew up in Yamhill County of counselors and teachers and law enforcement and members of the DAs and the faith community, and said, we have to do something. We know these kids, there are kids in our community that have been abused. And here we are, we're taking them to the hospital, then we're taking them to the DHS office, and then they're going to the police station or the sheriff's department to make a statement. And every time it's re-traumatizing. And there's this new movement of creating these centers that says, let's bring everybody to the center. And that child can then tell their story one time.
And this was in what years did you say?
The early 90s is when this began.
And this is the genesis when Juliet's
This was
house.
the genesis of the creation of Juliet's House. And at that time, John Peterson, who was an attorney here in town, his wife Molly was a school counselor. And it was one of her kids that really got her engaged in this idea. John had a client, Paul and Juliet Barber, who many people in the community still remember. He was in the lumber industry. John Peterson convinced the Barbers to get involved. And as it turned out, they had this office building on the south side of town, across the street essentially from Linfield College. And they said, you know what? We can tear down most of that building and rebuild it as a center that is designed specifically to work with these kids. Unfortunately, Juliet did not survive until the doors opened. And the group that was leading the charge to build Juliet's house said, in honor of her, let's name it after her. And so we're Juliet's House.
Okay.
And for 21 years, this building has been serving us incredibly well. But we're now at a point that we're running out of space.
Really, I hadn't heard that.
We are. Well, we're getting ready. We're going to be doing some capital work, capital campaign work. We've got a big front porch that we want to enclose most of it, create a private waiting room.
Ah.
We have a lot more traffic coming in and out of Juliet's house now.
The waiting room is right next to the front door.
It is right now,
Forget
and
that.
we want to create a nice private waiting room for families, a little more office space. We've just had an incredible 3-day retreat with our board of directors. Got 6 new board members, people from the community that love what we do, invested in this mission. And we're doing some long-range planning about where do we need to be in 5 years.
That was a Thursday, Friday, Saturday retreat.
Right, right.
That was committed. You were
We did.
there.
We went down to Chinook Winds. They took great care of us down there. And we got away from town, we got away from families and everything, and really focused on who are we as an organization and where do we need to be in several years? What are the steps it's going to take to get us there? From fundraising to programmatic to the vision of what our mission could be. There are some of us that say there's a broader need for dealing with other types of trauma in children, because trauma is trauma to a child.
Okay.
And trauma is based not necessarily on the event itself, it's how the child takes in that event. For most kids, let's say divorce is traumatizing. It's not the same as seeing a sibling murdered. But to that child, if it's a particularly angry, vicious divorce process, that can be horribly traumatizing. But there's not really a good system to help that child right now. Maybe they get into counseling. Maybe that counselor has got trauma training, what we call trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. But chances are in this community, until now, with our new therapist, that level of treatment has not really been available to a child.
Well, I had you on the show, was it when you first got to town, maybe?
Yeah,
3 years ago.
Almost 2 years ago.
And we did a pretty good job of covering the intervention and the prevention, but things have grown since then. And
Quite a
what
bit.
popped up on my in front of me was Kevin Chambers saying, "Hey, I just took this training through Juliet's house about sex abuse awareness, and it was really good." And so I think I called you up and said, "What's this?
What is this thing?"
Yeah, come and talk to the show on my show, and where can I get trained?" So the next one on the calendar was at the chamber, and you were training the chamber staff, and I sat through that. And there's a incredible statistic related to this training. Tell us what that is.
1 in 5 girls will be sexually abused before they're 18 years of age, and 1 in 6 boys.
Yeah.
It's astounding. It's one of those things in our society that we don't want to think about, we don't want to talk about, and up until the last few years, we haven't done a whole lot about, until it just sort of falls in our lap, like the doctor for the gymnastics team for the Olympics. That became just a huge phenomena, and people were saying, even people engaged in it had no idea it was happening.
Now, one thing I learned at training was that it's better now than it used to be, as far as awareness having affected the rates of abuse.
Right.
Which is a good thing, but it's still so high. That means it was higher in the past, but the fact that more people are becoming aware means that this is a way to treat it.
Exactly. One of the great things is the more communities talk about child abuse and child abuse prevention, that in and of itself has a preventative effect. There are, sadly, angrily, predators in the world, people who actively go out and want to abuse children, just like there are those that abuse animals or abuse seniors. They're vulnerable populations. Kids, particularly with disabilities, are especially vulnerable. But kids in general are vulnerable. We know that statistically less than 10% of abuse cases actually get reported. Now that means 90+% of people in our communities are walking around They've got abuse in their past. It was never treated, perhaps, unless they took that initiative or their family took some initiative at some point. This really came home to me last April when we were doing a fundraiser to hire this therapist, and an 80-plus-year-old woman walked into Juliet's house and said, I want to talk to somebody. I got this letter in the mail, and I wanted to understand what this therapist is supposed to do. So I came out, and I talked with her. She got it, and suddenly tears started rolling down her eyes, and she grabbed the lapels of my jacket and said, I wish to God there had been a Juliet's house when I was a little girl with me and my sister.
Oh, my.
He was an 80-plus-year woman who had been dealing with these demons in her life all of that time. And then she turned around and she said, I want to make sure it doesn't happen to any other child. And she wrote us a check, which just astounded me. But she got it. She got why we need to invest in the lives of these children. You can turn their lives around. You can turn their families' lives around.
Another thing that Kevin said to me that caught my ear was the statistic about when a community takes this training, what happens? Tell us about that.
Working with Ford Family Foundation out of Roseburg, they have done an incredible job of taking a program called Stewards of Children. And they've created an umbrella program called Protect Our Children that's for the state of Oregon, trying to educate at least 5% of our adult population. There is research that says if a community's adults are educated in this program about what child abuse looks like, what's the impact of it, and what can you do if you work with kids, how do you protect yourself, how do you protect your church or your school or your sporting arena, whatever it may be, that 5% then becomes a tipping point that the discussion of child abuse and child abuse prevention and child welfare becomes woven into the fabric of that community. So that if there's a group of 20 people and one person is going to raise their hand and say, hey, do we have policies and procedures to protect kids? What are they?
Yeah. Wherever kids are.
Wherever kids are.
Church,
School, sporting. We've had dance schools that have taken the training. And they changed some of their policies and procedures, and they put in cameras, and they're doing things to protect their kids. The beauty is it has an effect of, number one, protecting society more broadly, but again, raising that discussion into the overall community, because a predator, they're not going to want to live in a community where everybody's talking about child abuse and child abuse prevention.
And aware.
And aware.
And going,
they're going to be looking.
Yeah.
We're putting eyes on the street that says, if you do something that is amiss in such a way that it raises the hackles on the back of our neck, we know what to do about it. We know how to report it. And we may not catch you this time, but we're going to keep an eye out.
It won't be so easy.
And I think it's really important to help people understand, we're not talking about being paranoid. We're talking about being aware. That's the biggest battle. What's happened recently over the last several years is because of horrific events like the gymnastics doctor, like what happened in Pennsylvania, what's happened in various churches and schools around the country, people are now much more willing to engage and say, you know what, this is real. And there's something we can do about it. The whole Me Too movement is about the same thing. There have been practices and behaviors that have gone on for millennia that we've just turned a blind eye to and said, well, boys will be boys, or, you know, those things just sort of happen. You got to suck it up and keep going forward. And now people are saying, no, we don't have to just go forward. We can deal with this.
And there's another difference that you were telling me about, and that is that oftentimes a child will come forward with a story about someone that you just can't believe it.
Right.
And so you assume that the child is not telling the truth. That's your first thought. But tell me about that.
Our position is it is extraordinarily rare for a child to make a disclosure of somebody hurting them, abusing them, particularly sexual abuse, if it's not true. It can happen. It doesn't happen often. The beauty of what we do at Juliet's house is that we have highly trained interviewers that work with that child, and they can tell pretty quickly, is this a fabrication or is there something there? Is there something that we need to help draw that child out to talk about more clearly as best we can? And there are cases, quite honestly, where a child may come back 2 or 3 times because maybe the first time they're not really ready to talk about it. Or they've disclosed to maybe mom or an aunt or an uncle or dad. But when they come to Juliet's house, they're not quite ready. And maybe it's a month or 2 months or 3 months later, they say, I'm ready to talk about it. Our position is always to begin by believing the child. And I think that's important for all of us. If it's rare for them to fabricate a story, we should all begin with the point of believing this child and taking appropriate action. And the most appropriate action is to report it to DHS, Child Protective Services.
That's the right thing to do.
That's the right thing
When
to
the
do.
child says something along this line, you don't try to figure it out. You don't
You don't
find
try to
out
figure
what
it
happened.
out. Leave that to the professionals.
You hear it and you call DHS.
Right.
That's the right thing to do.
That's the right thing to do.
One,
You can
two.
even report it anonymously
Uh-huh.
if you don't want to get involved.
Uh-huh.
The bottom line is that then DHS has a report. There may be enough evidence for them to take action. They may have a number of files on this child or reports on this child. That sort of elevates the case for them then to say, you know what, there's something going on. We need to do some more digging to find out what might be happening with this child.
Russell, let's spend a few minutes just giving the kind of the overview of the basics of abuse prevention. And one that comes to my mind is a child is not alone with another adult.
Right. If they're in an institutional environment, like a school
Right.
or church or some activity where they're in a building somewhere, one, to protect that child, to make sure that there are always safe adults around them at all times, that they're not left alone, and it's always preferably 2 adults. That's also to protect that organization. Even when a kid goes to the bathroom, you want 2 adults there. And it can be a highly responsible older teenager. It doesn't have to be, somebody over 18. And it's not the law. It's just good practice that you go together and you make sure and you wash up and you come back to the classroom or to whatever activity, if it's sports or whatever. That's one thing. Lighting is really important. One of my staff members even used to work for YMCA here in the country, in Oregon, and he said he went through this training and discovered, or dawned on him, the racquetball courts at this particular YMCA locked from the inside, and there were no windows. So a predator could take a child into that room and abuse them, and nobody would see it. And their walls are so thick, nobody would hear them. So immediately, they found the money, they cut windows into them, they removed the locks. And so that's now a safer, much safer place for those kids and even for the adults. Because even an adult could get injured in there and nobody would know. So the beauty is these practices begin to impact not just the children, but the overall, everyone who participates in these activities, no matter where it is. But you want to be able to recognize what the signs are of abuse.
Can you give us just some obvious, just the top?
Oh,
We're not
probably
going to
one of the
experts,
most,
but just
one of the most obvious ones is if a child is normally very gregarious and outgoing and laughs a lot and suddenly seems very withdrawn, chances are something has happened to that child. Don't know the severity, don't know necessarily what happened. And there are ways that you can easily sort of probe around the edges and ask a child. And if they trust you, chances are they will say something, particularly if they know they can say whatever and not get in trouble for it. Or frequently, children will want to protect. If their abuser is somebody who's particularly close to them, they may want to protect that person. Oh, I don't want daddy to get in trouble. I don't want my aunt or uncle to get in trouble, because maybe then they'll be taken away from me. It can be very complicated. None of this is easy. None of this is easy work. And that's why, our interviewers, our medical staff, they not only go through years of training, they continue to get training. There are new techniques, sharing ideas across centers and other professionals. So we're very fortunate in this community to have such high level professionals. But understanding what child abuse can look like, and frequently it's the people close to them. Maybe it's a teacher that sees bruising on a child or strange bruising. We had a case not long ago where a child had bruises on both sides of their cheeks. And the question was, did you run into something? I fell down. Did you fall down on both sides of your face? Yes. Well, as it turned out, child had done something a relative didn't like, their caregiver didn't like. The caregiver grabbed them by the chin to get their attention and squeezed too hard. That's not a case that we're going to prosecute, that the DA is going to prosecute. That's where good parenting skills, some home visitation, putting them through some parenting training, that's not the way to do it. That's not productive. Another way that we're very fortunate in this community is our law enforcement, our DA's office are very highly trained in this. And they can tell, is this a case where somebody has deliberately tried to hurt a child? Or is it a case where mom, dad, whomever got overwrought, and in a second they smacked the child, and the child got hurt further? They're going to make that judgment should we prosecute this? And if not, then we have judges that are also pretty highly trained in this county. They also will help make that decision. What's going to be the best course to try to keep this family intact, to try to move it forward positively? We have to remember that there are a lot, let me put it this way. There are a lot of families that don't have good role models. So the parenting that they were raised with is going to be the parenting that they're going to use, most likely. Until somebody intervenes and said, you know what, there's a better way of doing that. Spanking your child is not a good way of disciplining them, because violence is violence. It's that simple. And you can put that child in timeout. You can take away their Game Boy or whatever it may be. You can do those sorts of things that train them of what is better behavior than beating them, because that doesn't work in the long run. So
this rollout of this training, the training again is called
Stewards of Children.
Stewards of Children, and you're trying to reach key people because you don't have the staff to talk to everyone at first.
Right.
You want to get to those people that are working with children, around children, heads of organizations in which children are involved. So those are the people that you would like to reach, and also to businesses. Businesses
as well. The idea is that there needs to be a very grassroots, peer-to-peer approach to this program. It's an intensive 2.5-hour training with some pre-testing and post-testing. Part of that is working with Ford Family Foundation. They're working with the University of Oregon to do some research. And the beauty is it's showing over a 2-year period so far, studying, going 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months out, randomly selected people who've been through the training. The memory level of this training is quite high. I mean, not just barely statistically high. I mean, it's like very high. It's 60 plus percentile high that people remember this training. So it's a 2.5-hour training. And the idea is that the more people talk, again, about what this training does and gets and understands that maybe their staff will benefit from it. That's where we're focusing first, is getting organizations like churches, like businesses, banks. I'm talking with Virginia Garcia very soon about getting their staff trained in this program. Parks and Recs, we've had some wonderful training with those folks because they see kids all the time. We want all kinds of organizations that particularly work with kids to get this training, to learn about child abuse, what it looks like, what do you do about it, how do you protect it, how do you create a safer environment. And over time, we'd love to get more facilitators, volunteers that say, I want to get that training. I want to get out there and I want to help my community do it. So if you're a part of a service organization like Rotary, Kiwanis, Seroptimus, all of those groups, you should be out there helping us. Get the training first. Then if you want to jump on board and become a facilitator, we'll help you with that process. There are all kinds of coaches that we're right now talking with. We're already pretty embedded in schools and a lot of the education that we do, but we would love to have every school teacher, every administrator go through this program, every first responder.
All right, so if people have heard their organization described like a business of people that deal with children, they should call Juliet's house and say, hey, we'd like to train.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, well, I'd like to leave that message just blaring, that this is the way to reduce child abuse in our county.
We know that 95% of child abuse is preventable.
95%.
95, and they say that the biggest hurdle is public awareness. If we can get the public trained, we can prevent 95%. Imagine what would happen with our criminal justice system if we got kids before they hit that system and turn their lives around. We can do this. It can change the fabric of our entire community.
Thank you so much for
Thank
being here
you.
to declare that to us.